Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar, Changing Disagreement into Dialogue, How to Manage Conflicts and Enhance Communication. Some brief housekeeping as we get started. Your control panel on the webinar today allows you to choose how you participate in the audio portion of this program. So you've joined in listen-only mode. You'll remain muted throughout the program. We welcome your questions and comments throughout. If you have a panel here where you can key those in, we encourage you to put them in early and often. We will take as many questions as we can throughout the program. We'd love this to be as interactive as possible, so we'd love to hear from you on what you'd like to learn more about. We're scheduled for 60 minutes together, which will include our presentation and Q&A time, which we may handle throughout, or we may handle some at the end. And today's program is also being recorded. So shortly after the program, you'll receive an email that includes the presentation slides and some additional educational resources that relate to the topic. You'll also get access to the recording within 48 hours. So please allow about 48 hours to get the email with the link to access that recording. Also today, we're going to reference a handout. You may be able to see in your pod there access to the handout download currently. If you want to, you can download that and refer to it as we get to that portion of the program. If not, that will come in your email after we get that out to you within 48 hours after the program. Before we get started, a couple of notes. We value confidentiality, so we often use cases and scenarios to describe the concepts that we're exploring in these discussions, and any cases that we share are either publicly available, approved for use, or they're composites or amalgams from many of our common client experiences. And to allow for the most open participation in the Q&A sessions, questions asked in the program today we will answer identifying you by your first name only. This is also an educational dialogue. So we're going to talk about some approaches and ideas. They may be helpful in some situations for your family, but a best practice is only a best practice if it's best for your family. So we encourage you to draw some ideas and see how they might apply and consult your own advisors as appropriate to see how they might apply in your own situation. And with that, let's say hello to our expert resource today. Amy Wirtz is a consultant with the Family Business Consulting Group, specializing in shareholder value enhancement, business planning processes, and transition of management, leadership, or ownership of businesses. Amy is based in Ohio. Hi, Amy.
Hi, how are you, Christy?
Doing very well. Happy to have you here with us today. And I am Christy Data. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. So today we're going to talk about conflict. Many people don't like the idea of their family having conflict. So Amy, how do you frame the idea of conflict for your clients?
Well, first I try to normalize it. Actually, Christy, I do a little mantra with my clients. That's kind of fun. I actually have them say with me in a group setting or the business people, conflict is good. Conflict is good. And they laugh at me, but our society really portrays conflict as a very negative thing. And I would say with most examples that are given in today's society, conflict is and can be a pretty negative thing. However, when done correctly in a safe space with boundaries, with rules, it can create solutions that haven't risen to the top before. The more we kick the can down the road, the bigger the problem gets, the bigger the anxiety gets, the less solutions are created. So I try to help them feel comfortable with the decisions to engage in difficult conversations.
Perfect. And one of the interesting aspects of your background is that you've been a practicing attorney for many years. You shifted your focus to family business consulting. But how has your career impacted the way that you think about conflict?
Oh, it's completely shaped how I think about conflict. I started my career in the criminal courtroom, and that was an easy place to be because right was wrong, wrong was right. I mean, there were some jury trials, but when I moved into family work, I figured out that the court system and taking positions and not listening to each other and not letting the clients solve their own problems created more problems than not. Imposed resolutions on families typically are not adopted and used. So what I found was mediation and going into collaborative law helped my clients be the really intelligent, creative people they are by teaching them how to talk again after times of high stress or a breach of trust. And once we gave them a safe space, modeled that behavior, it wasn't conflict-free or it wasn't pain-free, but it reduced the negative impact of all of the other people involved in their lives and the event itself. And we as professionals created a space for them to be the solution makers. And when they made their own solutions, they actually followed them. So it completely shaped how I see conflict.
Great. And I think we're going to hear a lot of that theme through our discussion today. So let's talk a little bit about our learning objectives. What are we going to cover in today's discussion?
So today we're going to learn how to discuss things that keep popping up. So the skills I'm teaching today are not about like, where are we going to dinner tomorrow night? We can't get 5 people to agree where we're going to dinner. We're talking about really important things like how do people get paid in a family business? And that keeps coming up over and over again. Or do you let in-laws have ownership? Or what do we do with Uncle Joe, who's 78 years old and has Alzheimer's, and some people want him to go home and some people don't want him to go home, and we think we've made a decision and then we don't have one. Those are the things we're talking about. So in today's context, what I'm trying to do is teach people how to grapple with that thing that keeps popping up. And instead of having the conversation you've had 12 times, we're going to change how we have that conversation. First, we're going to really think about what is it we're fighting about. We're going to separate the emotion and the past history from the real issue. We're going to try to move to the third story. So in order to do that, we're going to figure out a 4-step process in order to change the way we're having the conversations. We're going to do work before we have that conversation. And when we do that work, we're going to really sit down and write out what is it that we're struggling with? Is it our feelings? Is it the other person's feelings? Is it our own identity? Is it impacting the other person's identity? Or is it facts? Is it what happened or how it happened? And I'm going to give you some new tools to unbundle that before you go into the new kind of conversations so you can problem solve.
Perfect. And I wanted to note also, conflict is a big topic. It's a complex topic. It shows up differently in a lot of different families. So what we're going to talk about today is really a couple of tools in the toolkit. And I believe that they're going to be applicable for everybody. They're things that people are going to be able to use and apply in their own life. But it's not necessarily the whole solution, right? So this is a piece of the puzzle that people can learn from. I think it's a reasonable scope for today's discussion. And then it's something you keep learning over time, right?
Yeah, and I still learn. I've had my law school education, my law school experience, my legal experience. I've had 172 continuing credit education stuff on this subject. I continue to take continuing education on this. It constantly evolves, and you can always brush up your skills.
Perfect. All right, so what makes family business conflict different or unique from families that don't own a business? Or what makes it more complex?
When I talk to families about this issue, I always say it's because you have so many circles you play in. So just like this slide, Venn diagrams, family business owners are working in 3 systems. And, when you're a dad and you're talking to your son at home, that's pretty clear. But when you're a dad and you're his boss and he's your manager at work, and by the way, you're the owner of the business and he's the owner of the business, we've got now 3 things that we're processing. So what's complex for family business owners is, what system am I having this conflict in? Where should I be having the conversation? And who should be part of it, right? So if you look at all these systems and circles, look at all the people that play in this, right? So when dad is talking to his son about a work issue, he might go home, tell his wife gets involved and is upset that her son is upset. So now we've dragged it into the family circle. So where are we having the conversation, and who is it about, and who should be involved? That's where it gets complex, and it's different from all other conflict, I think.
Yeah, it's an important lens to keep in mind as we think about these conflict situations.
And if you add that into a boardroom, it gets even more complicated.
For sure, for sure. So the framework we're going to use today is interest-based conversations. Why do you find this framework is useful for families who are looking to have more productive conversations?
Because it gets into the why of the issues rather than just a position. So when you're using interest-based resolutions, we ask why, what, when, where. We get behind the statement involved, all right? So I'm going to give you an example. You and Karen come to me and you have an orange and you say, Amy, divide the orange. So I take the orange and I cut it in half and I weigh it and I make sure each of you have 50%. Now in most societies, that's pretty fair, right? I'm giving you each half. However, if I were to ask you, Christy, why do you want this orange? You would say, I want to make orange juice. And if I were to ask Karen why she wants the orange, she wants to make orange flavored muffins. So by dividing it in half, neither one of you got what you needed. You got a fair division, but you didn't get what you needed. And if I had asked, I would have peeled the rind off and given the rind to the cupcake maker, and I would have given the inside to the person that wanted to make the juice, and you guys would have been really happy, even though you didn't get exactly the same thing. That's the key to interest-based conversations. We want to know why. What is it that you're trying to get to? Then we gather all the information needed to get you there. We make sure everybody has that information, and then we solve the problem. The difficulty is in positional bargaining or resolution. We define our position, then we give a solution. We don't do information gathering. We don't make sure the other side has that information and understand it, nor do we separate any emotion from our stance. So we're not heard. And often we don't reach resolution until somebody imposes it upon us.
Mm-hmm.
So this book is something our readers can look at, or our attendees can look at, to dive deeper into changing disagreement into dialogue. I recommend this book. I teach this book repeatedly. Great read.
Good.
So
we're going to spend some time going over the model so people can understand how to think about these conversations. And again, this is where the handout may come in handy as we get close to the end of this discussion. And you'll receive that again by email if you haven't found it in your chat pod already.
Okay, so one of the first things we're going to do is decide, are we engaging in this conversation again, or are we not? So go back to your original understanding of conflict, which is daily, minute by minute, we as human beings go fight or flight when we're set into a position where we're in a conflict. It's where our brain goes naturally, okay? If you decide that it's worth having, we have to then write down what are the consequences and how are we going to do it differently, which are the next steps that we're going to teach. But if we say we're not going to have it, what are the consequences of not engaging in this conversation? Again, we should be writing those down too. And the reason is otherwise it's just a gut reaction and we do no analysis, and we may get very stuck when all we do is go to our primal part of our brain and go fight or flight, fight or flight. So I have a good analogy to this. If you have parented teenagers ever in your life, you do, should I engage or shouldn't I engage? With some teenagers every 15 minutes, with some teenagers hourly, with some teenagers daily, but you do it a lot because there are a lot of things you can correct in adolescent behavior. You kind of got to pick what's really important or you lose street cred. So that's part of that engage, don't engage process. So if you decide you're going to engage, we're going to teach you some different ways to engage a repeated conflict. Okay, so when we get ready to do this, we are going to debrief with ourselves in a piece of paper, which is part of your handout that you can download. What kind of conversation or conflict am I in? So when we're dealing with repeated conflict, they tend to circle around these three things: feelings, what happened in facts, and our own identity and the identity of the other players. So we're going to break that up and we're going to dissect the repeated conflict under those three things. All right, next slide. So the what happened or the fact section of this is the most complicated work we'll do in getting ready. And the reason is because conflict is all about perceptions and views of an event or views of an issue. The more people involved, the more views we have. And so getting into facts about he said, she said, this is what happened, this didn't what happened, is really all that occurs. And what we're fighting about is who's right and who's wrong. And we're not taking the time to say, what is it that is the core of this conflict? And I'm going to give you an example. A brother and a sister are working for a company. Sister has worked there longer. She's been there 5 years, longer than her brother. She's married and she has 3 little kids. They're both managers of different divisions. Sister only works 3.5 days a week. Brother works 5. And by the way, they make the same amount of money, which rubs brother very raw. And they've had many conversations about this, some calmly, some not calmly. She tells her brother at the front door of the building that she has to leave early to go pick her daughter up from the orthodontist. And in passing, the brother says to her, "Must be nice to be the favorite princess of the company and do whatever you want. Oh, and by the way, make the same money of those that slave 5 days a week." This comment is made in front of another manager and 2 employees. Needless to say, sister is a little angry, right? Now, setting compensation policies has been brought up in the advisory room, in the advisory board. It's been brought up in family meetings. It has been brought up by both children to dad. Dad, who's the owner of the company, keeps saying, well, I just need to do a little more research. I need to talk to the accountant. I need to talk to my lawyer. I need to talk to my peer group. Dad is completely uncomfortable with setting consistent standards for compensation. The real issue is there is no rule. And thus, the children feel competitive and they pit each other against each other, right? So that's the real issue. Moving into why the policy would help decrease that, or why we have policies will help change that conversation. It's really not about who's right or wrong. It's not about whether the daughter who's worked 5 years longer and went to 3.5 days is making the same amount of money as the brother, right? It's about how the policy is set, and neither manager understands that. Now, I want you to add a third view to that. How do you think the other managers see that aren't family, right? That's the complexity of who said what. So if you go to the next slide, how do we change that? How do we move into the why? When we change this conversation, we need to get to the why of the policy creation isn't happening. What is going on with the system or with dad that he's unwilling to set that compensation policy? Is it he's afraid that once it's set, he has no control over changing the policy in the future? But if we get to the why, we can make solutions for everybody in that. And again, it's not about did brother really mean to hurt sister or shame sister. It's about what the issue is. The issue is they can't get resolution to this difference in salary and hours. That's what we're talking about. And their perceptions are going to be different. Sister's going to say, I've worked here longer. I have more experience. You haven't been here as long. Brother's going to say, I work more hours, right? Neither one of them's wrong. They're both right, but what does that get us in the long term, right? If you could change the slide. So when we're in what happened conversations, it's really important that we move from assumptions to what's important, and we move to validate people's beliefs about the situation. Remember the situation I just said, neither one of those people's wrong. She does work 3.5 days a week. She has been there 5 years longer. They just feel it and see it differently. Remember that difficult conversations are never about being right. The more you dig into being right, the less you hear what the other person is saying, the less curious you become about possible solutions. And remember, the what happened conversations are about different perceptions, interpretations, and values. So the sister's value is being home with her kids and helping with the family business. The brother's values, I'm not married, I don't have kids, it's all about work. It's really different, right? They have different measurements of success or what's important to them. Here's a different example that I found in my work as a lawyer. Used to be that owners that were trying to come up with operating agreements would each hire a lawyer, and the lawyers would meet alone with their clients, and they would ship paper back and forth, okay? And what happened consistently with that dynamic is the owners would fight. And the owners would fight because they would receive the documents from the other lawyer and they go, this isn't what we talked about. What are you trying to do to me? Right? Like we've never seen that before, right? So when the legal community went, aha, this is about perception, and we all sat down together, both lawyers and both owners or multiple owners, and we co-drafted the language, what we discovered is our perceptions of drafting were very different. The owners wanted a document that they could live and breathe with, that could help them avoid conflict in the future. Lawyers were drafting the documents for a judge to review and understand when litigation occurred. So for the owners, it wasn't about what it said, it was about what it meant to their daily lives. For the lawyers, it was about what it said to a judge. How would the law interpret it, not how it would be applied. See how perceptions really impact what we do on a daily basis. And that's what we have to work on. Can we flip slides? So the next tangling that we get into and what happened is intentions. And wow, intentions are really complex. So when you write out, here was my intentions and what happened. And when you write out to change the conversation, here's what I think they intended. What you'll find is you make a ton of assumptions about what these people intended in the last conflict or a historical repetitive conflict. And what happens is we're about to engage in a repeated conversation. Our brain goes back to the last 3 times and our ears shut off. And we make a ton of assumptions about what Dad is going to say, or what Joe, the HR manager, is going to say, or what the lawyer is going to say. And we stop listening. Also, when we communicate our beliefs about that person's consumptions of their intentions, we assume usually negative harm, that these people are out to get us. So when we tell them that, they get defensive. As they get defensive, we get defensive. What happens again? Our listening skills go even further below average, and we stop hearing one another. So when we go to have that third story conversation we're working towards to change it to solution, we need to go to that conversation with the belief that everyone in the room is there with their best behavior, that they want to solve the problem, and they don't want to do anybody any harm. So we need to change that dynamic so we can hear better. And as my husband likes to tell me repeatedly, we have yet to perfect mind reading. So we cannot know what another person's intentions are, even though you know them very well. So the other part of the wheel that we work on and debrief is our feelings. So this slide asks, why should feelings be acknowledged? And I say, why shouldn't they be acknowledged? So when we don't acknowledge feelings, often we don't move forward. And I can tell you, after being in family law for 25 years, it is really hard for someone to sign an agreement ending their marriage until their feelings have been acknowledged by somebody. It doesn't work. They get stuck. The worst thing you can do when you are having a repeated conflict is to debate someone's stated feelings. So think about when you are dealing with a teenager after they broke up with their boyfriend and they're crying, and you say to them, don't be sad, that boy was a jerk. What kind of response are you going to get from your teenage daughter? Usually she'll cry harder, she'll yell at you, it becomes you're a horrible person, and we don't talk about the breakup, right? So if instead you say, I'm so sorry, you're so sad, I know this is really hard, what can I do to help you? Then you're talking about her, you're validating her feelings, right? When you're debriefing a repeated conversation, it's important that you write down what your feelings are as this comes up every time, but also what you think the other person's feelings are. I don't want you to assume, I want you to write down, they cry, they turn their back, they walk out of the room, they shuffle papers, they stare at their computer, they act like they don't hear me, they throw things, that's non-judgmental, or they yell. So there you can say, when you ask them how they were feeling and they say, I don't feel anything, you can say, you know, my memory is that you got up and you walked out of the room. Can you tell me more about why you chose to do that? So don't say that's because you were mad at me. It's tell me more, right? And remember that these conversations that we have that repeat frequently or repeat in history, often there are multiple layers of feelings going on. And what you observe in the first one, which in America is very common, is anger is the first emotion expressed a lot of times, though it's not the emotion underneath that's causing the behavior. It's just what we feel comfortable showing. So when you ask them, tell me more, they might say, I was angry. And you say, tell me more about why you were angry or what made you angry. Then they say, well, because you're asking me to leave a position I've held in the company for 25 years, and I'm afraid to make that change. And when I get afraid, I get mad. So now we're really doing work, right? That's why we have to think about the multiple layers going on. So the next part of the circle that we're going to work on and we're going to write out before we change our conversation is, how does this conflict impact our own identity, our self-image, our role in the family, and then how is that impacting others in the conversation? Where we see this the most is when we're transferring management roles between one generation and another, right? So the person that's been at the head of the company, or the 2 or 3 people that have been at the head of the company, are being asked by the next generation to step down. And we're just about to the end of the management succession schedule, and everything blows up. Even though by all accounts, the next generation is ready, they're on all the boards they're supposed to be, they're meeting their metrics, the sales are good, the employees are happy, but all of a sudden the person that's supposed to be leaving says, oh, they're not doing this right, and I don't like how they talk to this vendor, and I don't like how they talk to that customer. It really gets down to it is they are afraid to change their identity. They don't know where they fit in anymore. Where do they fit in as a provider at home? Where do they fit in as a role model to their children? Where do they fit into the community? That's all about self-image, career, all those things. And often when we're in that kind of an identity crisis, we misbehave because we don't know what to do with it. So if we can be empathetic, help them with that emotional stuff, we might be able to change the outcome. And that's what we're asking you to think about, right? And by the way, we don't control that, how this affects me or the I in the conversation. Our brain goes there without us knowing it all the time. And sometimes it hijacks the conversation. So if you're in the middle of a problem-solving meeting and all you're doing is thinking about how that issue is impacting you and you can't hear anybody, take a break, because your brain is hijacking you. Go to the bathroom, go get a Diet Coke, take 5 deep breaths, settle yourself, and then come back. Okay, so this is the handout slide. So our 4 steps while we're preparing to change to the 3rd story is make sure you do your homework ahead of time and walk through those 3 conversations, not just for yourself, but how it appears for others. So sometimes, I mean, if you think about this in family businesses, you might be writing out a scenario with 5 people involved. This is going to take some effort and some work. And as you write those things out, you're going to start creating the commonalities. You're going to see the links between the stories. And then that's how we write the 3rd story. It's those links you're going to put on another piece of paper and say, oh, look, we all think this. We all see this. And by the way, what we're really all talking about is the compensation policy, not whether or not the sister makes more money than the son, right? So that's what we're doing as we do that. When you go into the meeting on this, here are some ground rules. If you're going to try and change disagreement to dialogue and problem solving, you need to set it at a neutral territory. There needs to be agendas ahead of time, no surprises. Keep it to a reasonable length of time, which means honestly no more than 2 hours. It's just about what most people can tolerate before their emotions become too raw to problem solve. Start from the 3rd story, be curious, be there to learn, and try to eliminate as much judgment from the initial conversation as you can. Go in believing others have the same intentions. If you go in believing that the other people there are out to get you, you will create an environment where you self-promulgate that. It will happen. You will become defensive, they'll become defensive. So you really have to open your mind and your ears to new problem-solving techniques. And remember the steps. Make sure everybody understands what you're talking about. What's the issue that we're trying to solve? Are the right people in the room? What information do we need to have before we go to solution? Does everybody understand that information? And once you can establish all of those things, you can move into creating solutions. But I'm going to ask one more thing of the audience. When you come up with ideas, have it be a no judgment zone for the time that you're brainstorming. Once somebody puts something on the wall and everybody attacks it, the creativity in the room stops. So I also encourage people to do the brainstorming, take a break, come back in an hour and do the what works, what doesn't work, to have an actual physical separation between the 2 things, okay? The reason we do agendas is because there are a lot of people in this world that do not problem solve in front of other people in a public setting. If you have an agenda, everybody will come prepared, whether they're extroverted or introverted, and their anxiety will go down. So it really does work.
Perfect. So I've been listening to you talk through the model, Amy, and I think one of the things that's really powerful is all the things that you've recommended are things that an individual can control, because conflict can feel uncontrolled and there's all this emotion involved. I'm not going to say it's easy. I mean, some of this is self-management. It can be difficult, but there are things that anybody who's involved in a conversation can do.
Right.
Really useful. So sometimes though, we find ourselves in conflict with people whose behavior is really problematic, and
Yes.
maybe it feels like they cannot be reasoned with. How might someone recognize that kind of personality or that kind of situation?
Honestly, I think our bodies recognize it before our minds do. We get a lot of people when they're presented with a really high conflict personality, get a stomach ache, they get hot, they sweat, their heart starts racing. I again think it's that primal part of our brain where we go fight or flight, right? And we go back to the neocortex of our brain, and we almost don't control that part of our physical reaction. So if that starts happening, I would say take a deep breath and pause before you respond. But there's a high increase, it was kind of redundant, there is an increase in people that have high conflict personalities. We're seeing it on TV shows, we see it on the news, we read about it on Facebook, and oh my goodness, all this social media makes it really easy for people to be mean because you don't see each other, there's no physical contact, right? So it's like adolescence on steroids. So what we see is all or nothing thinking. These people have very little self-awareness about how their behavior impacts others and themselves. They have unmanaged emotions, meaning you can be talking to them and having a nice conversation, and what appears to be for no reason at all, they start screaming at you. Or they start bawling. And you're like, where did that come from? Are we on the same planet? Right? Very extreme behavior. And here's the other really big flag. They blame everybody else for anything bad that happens in their life. Nothing is their fault. We all have had interactions with people like this, either family members, teachers, employees, bosses. The more I do this work, the more I teach this class, I am shocked by the stories people tell me about interactions with management where they were screamed at, called swear words in front of other people, completely shamed. I have been blessed to never have had a manager like that. I can't even imagine the angst that it would take to go to work every day being managed by that. But we're going to try and give you some tips on how to deal with people that show this kind of behavior. So again, another book, you can do more reading on this. Bill Eddy is one of my favorite authorities on high conflict personalities. My favorite client book I give out is Biff. Quick responses to high conflict people, their personal attacks, hostile emails, and social media meltdowns, which we're seeing more and more of today. So grab this book. It's a short, easy read. I think it's also an audiobook. So I describe this behavior, and you'll see it in your workplace and in your families, as blame speak. That's a terminology that Bill Eddy created. But I think this is what you're going to feel and see. When you're involved with these people, it is emotionally intense. You'll pick up the phone, hi, John. And the first thing he says, you'll never believe what an employee did to me at work today. And it's not hello, Amy. How was your day, Amy? It's just immediately emotional puke. There's no other word. They like dump on you, right? It's a lot of personal attacks, if not at you, at the person they're talking about. But if the anger is at you, it's never about the issue. It's you're stupid, you're ugly, you're incapable of forming a thought. I mean, it's all these rude, intense attacks. And any problem in the relationship is your fault, not their fault. Lots of times this stuff comes up out of context. The worst part is that you'll see it in public a lot, and it's about reducing your status in social settings or work settings. You also know this behavior because you have an intense reaction to it, emotionally, intellectually, and physically. Like I went over a little bit about the physical reactions people have, but you're just like ready to seethe, and you're going, let me talk. even though your head is saying, don't talk, right? The front part of your brain is, there's no good thing that's going to come from this conversation, but the emotional part's going, but I have something to say. And that's what we get into. And so what I'm going to encourage you to do is not talk. It's really hard, super, super hard. If you could not engage, what I'm going to tell you is that's what's irritating to these people the most. So if you really want to affect them, don't respond. Right?
Yeah, I think it can be really challenging. I know when I get into a situation like that, I feel myself getting emotional. I think this is a great model for how to manage that. So why don't we share people some tactics?
Okay, so here's the tip. It's called Biff, just like the title of the book. When you respond, the advice is please try not to do it verbally. Try to do it in writing if you can. And the key is the message should be brief. And when I say brief, try to keep it under 4 sentences. It should be informative above all else. It should be friendly, not overly friendly, but friendly. And it should be firm. So the acronym is brief, informative, friendly, firm, or BIF. So the first question we have is, before we should respond at all, is should I respond or shouldn't I respond? So here's my little tips. Do not respond if no one else is involved in the dialogue, because it's not going to go anywhere. Do not respond if there is no clear issue that you can find in the conversation, or if it's an opinion-heavy dialogue. I think you should. I think this. I think that. Try not to respond because they really don't care what you think at that point. Try not to respond if there's typically no way to change that person's opinion. I saw this a lot in divorce work about parenting styles, okay? And there is also do not respond if has already been a response and it was ignored. So these people tend to be repeat callers, repeat emailers, or repeat texters. We would see, I am working with a family right now where there is one particular person that when he doesn't feel validated or heard, will text 17, 18 times in 15 minutes to one person until they're like finally like, oh, okay. But, you know, that's the kind of things we're talking about here. So when do you respond? Respond when it's in public or a team setting and you're being attacked. You don't want to look like a wallflower. There are sometimes you need to tamp things down. Respond if you feel that being silent is making it appear that the other person is correct or you're acquiescing to their stance. Also, there are times when emotions are just so intense you can't keep them bottled up. And in these situations, what I find is when the other person is starting to believe the misstatements of the emotionally intense person or high conflict person, you got to correct the record. Because if they're starting to impact your brain that much, imagine what they're doing to the rest of the people in the room. Okay. But again, if you're going to respond, use the acronym: brief, informative. Can you go back to that slide, Christy, real quick?
Yep.
Brief, informative, friendly, and firm. So Beth, it's an easy little thing to carry around with you. And by the way, after you're writing a response and you're doubtful that it is any of those things, give it to someone else to read before you hit send, or wait a couple hours before you hit send. That's the other key.
Good advice. It's the benefit of doing things in writing is you can have a little time.
Yeah. So the other thing we have to determine is, what is our goal in responding to this person? Are we managing the relationship? Are we reducing the relationship with the highly contentious person? Or are we ending the relationship with that person? How we respond differs based in all 3 of those scenarios. You know, often we can't end relationships with family members. And I have had in the last year 3 families where there are portions of the family that can no longer talk to each other because of politics. So my recommendation is, why are we talking about it at all? I mean, if we know that, can we have a relationship if we agree not to talk about politics? You know, 7 years ago, we would have Thanksgiving fine. In today's political environment, we can't have Thanksgiving anymore. Can't we set some boundaries and some limits to that situation? So it just shows me how intense our high conflict society has become when we can't put boundaries around things. So really we have to talk about what we're writing. So it's easy to write in the relationship, I think. Maybe it's not for others, but for me it's, thank you very much. It's been nice having you as a vendor, but because of this behavior, we are no longer using your services. Wish you the best of luck. It's done, right? But when you're managing the relationship, it gets a little bit more dicey. So what we're trying to do is put safe boundaries involved. Typically, people that are doing with family need help with that. And that's why people like FBCG exists. So we're there to help with those things. Here's my last tip for high conflict people. Avoid the A's. When you're responding verbally or in writing, it does no good with these people to give admonishments about their behavior, because remember, they have no insight into their behavior. It does no good to give advice, remember, because they don't care. They just are not able to process it. And apologies will be weaponized. Do not give them. They do not work. So avoid your A's. Avoid admonishments, advice, and apologies.
So thank you, Amy. I think you've done a great job of outlining a couple of good models that people can take back and use. And for the books as reference for people who are interested in diving further into the concepts, I think that's super helpful. Let's go to Q&A here in a moment. Before we do, so if people should be entering their questions into the chat pod, please type those in. We'll be happy to follow up with you after the program if there's things that we can't get to here. Before we get to that, while people are still typing, why don't you give us a final thought here on conflict?
So this is one of my favorite sayings, and it is about conflict. If I think you're wrong, either I am unaware of something or you are. So unless I want to play a superiority game, I should take the time to find out what you're looking at. You're wrong means I don't understand you. I'm not seeing what you're seeing, but there's nothing wrong with you personally. You're simply not me. And by the way, that's not wrong.
Thank you. All right. Just before we launch into questions, a couple additional resources that people may want to take advantage of. This fall, we have the Family Governance Forum, October 17th and 18th. This is a program that's designed for people who are in leadership roles on family governance, like family councils, shareholders representatives, next generation committee members. Our theme is Accelerate. We're going to be talking about how to build momentum in your governance activities. Really looking forward to that program. Information is online. We also have our newsletters, which many of you receive, but you can access through the website. We have a recent book on family champions and champion families available on Amazon. That is for, it talks about the person in a family system who really has an opportunity to help change the family culture, which can be really applicable to this topic in terms of conflict. And you can see our past webinars also online. You'll see a tab there for webinar recordings that you can access programs that we've done in the past. They're all for free. So we will go ahead and do some questions here, Amy. So we've talked about the scenarios we talked about are sort of a little bit in the moment and topical, but how do you think about this in terms of a long-standing conflict inside a family, especially if you've got a group of siblings which may have decades of past behaviors and scars and mistrust that have brought them to where they are?
So it's my opinion, anybody can change behavior. And if people are willing to heal and work on trust and decide that they want to have conversations differently, I haven't yet met anybody that isn't teachable when they want to do the work. So to me, sibling groups are where most of this work is done. And doing the work is the biggest gift you can give to the next generation. Showing that you can learn, showing that you prioritize your relationships enough to take the time to gain new skills, and modeling problem solving for the next generation, it's worth more than money, because they can take it not just in their business, but in their own marriages, their own parenting styles, their relationships with their cousins. And it goes from the family to the business to the boardroom. It doesn't matter. So these skills go in all of the buckets of relationships, in my view. Does it take work? Yes. Typically, the bigger the sibling group, the more important it is to have a facilitator, work with them on these skills, doing individual work and then group work, and then setting up safe places to practice them. And I have successfully done that with many families. And the best day is when they call me and say, Amy, we did it. We took these skills and we did it on our own, and we didn't have to call you, and we solved our own problem. And I'm like a proud parent. I just jump up and down. I'm so happy for those people, because that's really what my job is to teach them skills, help them perfect it, and then leave. And let them teach it to the next generation and create a whole next generation of peacemakers and interested learners and problem solvers. That's my goal.
I love that. Sometimes it's just shifting the context a little bit can be a great start. I have a longer question here that I think we're going to mostly handle offline, but one of the questions, there's a sort of question inside of it, which is, what do you do with an ultimatum? If somebody presents you an ultimatum, how do you think about that?
Well, I would unbundle it. So I would go back in time and look at what came to the point of an ultimatum. So what occurred in the repeated conflict? I'm assuming there's a repeated conflict because I can't read it. But what got you to that ultimatum, and can you back the best up to change the conversation? And you first have to think about, is it worth going backwards, right? Is this person wanting to engage in changing the conversation? Is the person capable? Do you need help doing it, right? And I would start with those questions. Good. There's a lot more information I would need, but at least you could start on your own there.
So it's not irretrievable when you get the ultimatum.
I don't think so.
You can think about how to walk it back. A question from Debbie. We're dealing with a generation above us who are uncomfortable when shown empathy. Will these techniques work with people who have difficulty with empathy or feelings?
Yes. And when I work with a generation that's struggling with empathy, I work alone with them, and we talk about what's stopping them short. Like what in their past has changed their behavior, or what has occurred presently that they're empty of empathy. What's going on? I really try to peel that onion. And sometimes it's just a fear of conflict. And remember how I started the program where I worry more about people that never have fights than I do people that do? So some people get so anxious and engaging in conflict that they simply hide from it most of their lives. So they avoid decision making. And by the way, not making a decision is a decision. And there are consequences of that. I worked with someone recently and was able to show them that this next generation can have conflict productively. The previous generation that raised him could not, and it made him very afraid of conflict. And once he witnessed the next generation doing it right, all his fear drained. He's still not great at it, but he's much more willing to do it. And with support, he does it well.
It's being the person to take the step to be vulnerable, to do something different. It feels tough and risky, but it can really help to model for other people how it can work better.
Correct.
All right, another question here. So if somebody was listening to your discussion of high conflict personalities and recognized something in themselves, how does that person self-manage better?
I do a lot of reading, and I would get some workbooks and start digging in. And I'm going to tell you that most people that recognize those behaviors probably need to contact a professional to have some help, at least in the beginning, about where do I start? What do I do to help myself? How do I change some of this behavior? That's what I would do.
Great.
Again, Bill Eddy does great work. Look him up. He's got lots of books on this subject.
Seems like a good place to start for sure. Another question, how does one handle conflict between people that's based on different values or culture? I think we see this a lot in families where, you know, people have individual priorities and.
Yeah. So I would say that the first question I would ask is, do the people want to change the dynamic that have different values? That would be my first question. Or are they happy fighting? Because what I've learned with dealing with families is that for some families, conflict and fighting is where they're comfortable, and they really don't want it to change. It might make the other people around them uncomfortable, but they're okay with it, right? So one, do the people involved want it to change? Two, if they do, are they willing to learn about each other's different values and cultures and recognize the validity? Not that they have to adopt each other's stances, but give some validity to each other's stances. Mm-hmm. If we have that, we have stuff to work with. If we don't have that, we need to set boundaries around their relationship and around how it's impacting the total family dynamic.
Well, to build on that, I've got another question here about how can a conversation be started with a family patriarch or matriarch who refuses to discuss an issue time and time again? Does that connect the idea of if they're not willing to come to the table, then you're drawing boundaries?
Yeah, sometimes.
Are there tactics for reapproaching?
Yeah, I would say to you, my question is, have you listened to their story before you demand they talk about your story? So that's probably a whole nother webinar. But my question is, I see this in generational transfers a lot, where the receiving generation is really pushing the owning generation to get out of the way, right? And they're ready to take over. They're 50, they want the helm, they're ready to go, right? The 75-year-old isn't leaving. And there's no conversation about the 75-year-old leaving. And every time you talk about it, they say, we'll get to it. Yeah, we've got time. What I find is how to get that person engaged is to have the generation that's angsting to go and to get into power, either they or the generation below them do a historical interview with the owning generation about their journey in the business, where it started, where it's been, what they've grown it to, and then validate everything they've done, do a history wall, do a history book, put pictures together. Then we talk about what is the next chapter of this business or the family. Once they tell their story and they've been validated and it's acknowledged, it's easier for them to engage to the next chapter. It doesn't work for everybody, but it is a pretty common trick that helps.
Fantastic. I'm going to do one more question before we do. I'd like to remind everybody that we will have a survey that will pop up after you finish the webinar. We really do appreciate your feedback and ideas for future programs. and we'll look forward to seeing your responses on that. So there's actually a few questions here in the queue that have to do with the idea of ground rules. So if you're teeing up a meeting and you know that there's a chance for disagreement or conflict, what is the role of ground rules? How can you do that well to encourage people to be on their best behavior and move towards productive dialogue?
When I'm in a when I'm facilitating a meeting where we're changing the conversation on a repeated conflict, I ask everybody ahead of time and I prep everybody ahead of time, what are the ground rules for this conversation, right? And then we co-create them. I put them on the wall, and as a facilitator, I hold everybody accountable to those. Peer pressure is great, by the way, when they're on the wall. People typically will hold each other accountable. Mm-hmm. One of the ground rules I give people is what's called a mulligan. So when we're engaging in new behaviors and everyone in the room is trying on new skills, it's important to understand that we're going to make mistakes. And we have a rule that is the mulligan rule, which is when somebody takes a stance or they repeat old behavior, I or someone in the room will say, would you like a mulligan? Which is, would you like to restate that? Or, you know, golly gee, that was not good. You know, so saying, would you like a mulligan it's kind of a phrase that's to remind them to modulate their behavior. It works really well. I particularly don't like people talking over each other because it makes it hard for me to hear when I'm facilitating. In some cultures, that's just how they talk. So I bring it up. But we really co-create ground rules. The biggest ones when we're trying to change a conversation is no surprises. That's my two rules are no surprises and mulligans. So those are mine, and I ask everybody else to contribute theirs. And then you put them on the wall. You put them on one of those post-it sticky notes, and they're bright in front of everybody, and you keep people accountable.
I love the mulligan rule. That seems like a really easy way, if everybody agrees to it, to help keep people accountable for their behavior. That's fantastic. Okay, Amy, thank you for sharing your expertise today and giving us a lot of wonderful things to think about. Really appreciate your participation. And thank you to the audience for being with us today. We do these programs regularly. We hope to see you at one in the future. Again, please stick around, leave a couple of notes in your survey, and look out for the emails in the coming days with additional information and recordings. Hope you found this valuable and walked away with an item or two that you can apply. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.